As a fitness professional, you know the joy of helping others, and you know it's more than just fitness. We're training the whole person. Wellness coaching provides expertise that goes beyond fitness and nutrition. It's a holistic approach to helping others become their best selves while reaching their goals. To us, there's no greater joy than that. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified wellness coach. Go to nasm.org/wellness.
You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast with Derek Brown on the NASM Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, where we talk about mindful drinking, no and low alcohol cocktails, and social wellness. My name is Derek Brown, and I am an NASM certified wellness coach, an award-winning bartender, and author of Mindful Mixology, a comprehensive guide to no and low alcohol cocktails. Now, many years back, I was very lucky to be invited on a trip to go to Guadalajara, Mexico, with the Tequila Interchange Project. And this trip ostensibly was for us to go investigate these double chambered pots and look at them, see them in person, these double chambered pots that were found at a funerary site in Colima, which is in Western Mexico. And these double chambered pots were recreated in an act of experimental archaeology, and they were able to distill from them. Now, what's so interesting is this is in the 1st century BC, and the Capacha people. And that would really upend the story of this technology of distillation, which, as it exists, the earliest evidence of distillation is in ancient China. So as we went down there, it was unbelievable. We got to go with bartenders, tequila producers, and archaeologists. And one particular archaeologist on the trip was Dr. Patrick McGovern, who is a biomolecular archaeologist. And his job particularly was to collect shards from these pots and to determine if they had any biological matter, which basically means just residue from some product that would indicate that they had been used in distillation and that there was alcohol present, because obviously the alcohol had long evaporated. And so, but there might be other materials that were left behind. For instance, if it was beer, there might be hops. If it was wine, there might be something like tartaric acid. So these are different biological markers that they're going to take the shards, put them through a mass spectrometer, which is just a fancy machine that's going to determine whether it has these biological markers or biomarkers indicative of distillation. Now, unfortunately, in 2019, Dr. McGovern wrote a paper that indicated it was inconclusive. There was no evidence that distillation had happened. It doesn't mean it didn't. It just means that there's no existing evidence that it did, apart from this act of experimental archaeology. So that was very interesting. And the reason I tell you that is not just to share this cool trip that I took, which I think was just amazing in itself, but to talk about one particular moment in that trip where we went to a bar in Guadalajara called Paradusa Free, which is an amazing bar. If you're ever in Guadalajara, I highly recommend going there. It has traditional agave spirits. And so that means mezcal, raicilla, various different agave-based spirits that are from very localized producers. Then they serve jerky with hot sauce and play cumbia music. So it's like this fantastic bar. And when I was there, I was with the archaeologists, I was with the tequila producers, and I had some of the most amazing conversations I've ever had about the topic of alcohol and many other things, including our dreams. You know, we ended up going in all of these different directions. And the reason I bring it up is particularly to express that I think a big part of that, was the fact that we were drinking, that we were together on this trip, and these people from disparate backgrounds. Now, trust me, archaeologists and tequila producers and bartenders interact all the time, but not usually in the same room and on the other side of what we'll say the mahogany, on the other side of the bar. So it was really a particularly interesting moment for me. And I think that alcohol was was a big part of that. And I think the reason I bring that up is to maybe prove one of the theses in Dr. Edward Slingerland's book, Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. Now, just to test that, I brought Dr. Slingerland on the episode. He's here today with us, a distinguished university scholar and professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia and director of Database of Religious History, and of course, author of this wonderful book, Drunk. How are you, Dr. Singleton?
I'm well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure. So before we get into that thesis and get into a little deeper into your book, I want to ask a question. Obviously, you do quite a number of things. You're a scholar, a professor, and you run the Database of Religious History, and clearly you make time to drink as well.
Yes. Yes.
So
busy life.
How did you get into this position where you started researching and learning about the history of alcohol?
Well, my earliest work, so what the topic my dissertation was on, had to do with spontaneity, social interactions, charisma, and in particular, this tension that I sometimes call the paradox of trying not to try. This is actually my first trade book, was called Trying Not to Try. And it's about this tension you have when you know that you're going to be successful, or you're going to do something well if you can just relax and give up control and let things happen. But there's a paradox involved in trying to be spontaneous. And
Right.
in fact, it's a direct cognitive paradox, because when you're trying to relax, for instance, you're activating the part of your brain that you're actually trying to shut down. It's very similar to the paradox. If I say, don't think of a white bear, you think of a white bear because I've activated the concept. So in my earlier work, I talk about how the early Chinese philosophers come up with various techniques to get around this paradox, to kind of use your body to do things or breathe a certain way. But one of these Chinese thinkers uses drunkenness as a metaphor for being in this state of kind of spontaneous ease. And it's clear that in that text, it's just a metaphor. But that text made me start to think, well, alcohol is actually not a bad way to do it. So it's maybe a kind of chemical shortcut that we've developed as a culture to solve this problem of how you can try not to try. So I initially got interested in this topic because I started to think that alcohol might be a cultural technology that we've developed to help us get around this problem of how you can be spontaneous consciously, without destroying spontaneity, right? Without messing up the end product that you're looking for. So that was one route. The other route was my earlier work. This is related to the Database of Religious History. I'm interested in what I think of as mysteries that are hiding in plain sight. So things that humans do that we've always done. Everywhere you go around the world, you see people doing it. We've been doing it forever. As long as we have records of people, they've been doing these things. And yet, if you think about it, especially from an evolutionary perspective, these things are puzzling. So I previously looked at religion this way. So we just take it for granted that whenever we go to a culture, they're worshiping invisible beings and sacrificing things to them and scarifying themselves and cutting off the foreskin of their penis and foregoing delicious foods like pork and spending their day off of work sitting in an uncomfortable seat listening to a boring lecture. It's just natural, right? But it should be puzzling to us why people do this, because it's very costly behavior and it has no obvious benefit. And so if you don't believe that we're actually worshiping these gods are going to help us out. So my previous work tried to look at what might those benefits be when it comes to religious behavior, both for individuals and for groups. And I came to feel that alcohol was like religion in this regard, in the sense that everyone does it. We've been doing it forever. It's costly. Alcohol is a dangerous substance. It's physiologically not so great for you. And yet we've been doing it for as long as we've been doing anything in an organized way as a species. And so there's got to be benefits that are paying for this behavior that we haven't looked at. And so that's really the origins of drunk were these two strains, kind of how this is a useful tool and how seeing it as a useful tool can help explain the mystery of why we engage in this otherwise kind of puzzling behavior.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's an amazing, and somewhat circuitous route, but it makes complete sense when you describe it. And that's your past with this topic. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind then going farther back, because one thing that I'd really love to get into is the topic of evolution and alcohol, because it is a big part of your book. And you talk about two specific theories. I mean, obviously, alcohol has been there for, I think, in terms of our human ancestors, over 10 million years. So
Mhm.
it's got a long history with us. Why do you think it's there? And maybe you can give a second to each one of these theories, the hijack and the hangover theory.
Yeah, so the standard story about why so one way to look at what the book is about is trying to answer the question of why do we like to drink?
Mhm.
Um, the standard scientific story is there's no good reason. It's just an evolutionary mistake. And there's two types of evolutionary mistakes. The first type is what's called I refer to in the book as an evolutionary hijack. So this is where we have some reward network in our brain that evolved for some adaptive purpose, and then we figure out a way to trigger it for no good reason, for a reason that has nothing to do with its original purpose, but we get the reward without doing the behavior that the reward was for. And classic example that I start the book with of evolutionary hijack is masturbation,
Mhm.
or any kind of non-reproductive sex, right? So we get the orgasm is the best thing evolution can give you. It's like the biggest carrot, and it reserves that reward for the behavior that it wants to encourage the most, which is passing on copies of your genes to the next generation. So the adaptive target, to use evolutionary language, of the orgasm is reproductive sex. But humans and other species have very quickly figured out they could they could game the system and get that same reward in all sorts of wildly non-reproductive ways. Um, so that's a classic evolutionary hijack. We're hijacking a reward network and getting a reward for something that it's not supposed to be for. Um, Typically, with evolutionary hijacks, they persist because they're not terribly costly,
Mhm.
and masturbating is not terribly costly, despite what you may have heard in Catholic school. Or it's
Oh, yeah.
pretty harmless. Plenty of reproductive sex still gets had, or we wouldn't be here to talk about it. So that's one type of mistake. And that's the standard story about alcohol. So if you open a Psych 101 textbook, when it gets to chemical intoxicants, it'll probably tell you that it's a hijack of reward networks. There's a minority view before I wrote this book in the scientific community was the mismatch group. So people who subscribe to mismatch theories argue that the taste for alcohol actually was adaptive. So it wasn't originally a mistake. It had some adaptive target.
Right.
And there are various types of mismatch theories. Probably the most common is what I call the dirty water hypothesis. So the
Okay.
idea that for most of our evolutionary history, local water sources were not safe to drink because we didn't understand germ theory and we contaminated the water we were interacting with. But if you take contaminated water and you ferment it, it becomes potable. So the theory is, those of us who had a taste for alcohol would drink this beer, and that was safer than drinking untreated water, and that's why it was adaptive. The problem with that is there's lots of ways to treat water, including just boiling it, that are a lot easier than creating a double IPA,
Right.
mashing grain and getting hops. There are a lot of reasons why that doesn't make sense. There are other theories about kind of micronutrients that you get from fermenting grains into beer. The other big mismatch theory is this drunken monkey hypothesis that uh, a taste for ethanol. Ethanol is a very volatile molecule. You can smell it from far away. And so one theory is that when we were trying to hunt down fruit in the forest, we could smell ripe fruit from far away and find a source of calories.
Right.
Um, None of these things really, I argue in the book, make sense. And that's because the taste for alcohol is so costly. If you have any other route to get that same effect, we would have taken a different route. So there's got to be something adaptive about alcohol, um, that's remained adaptive to the present day to explain its persistence in human beings, both culturally and genetically.
Yeah. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast. My name is Derek Brown, and we're here with Dr. Edward Slingerland. We're talking about alcohol and evolution. And we just talked about drunk monkeys, or rather the drunk monkey hypothesis. So I want to get into that a little bit because in my first book that I wrote, it's called Spirit, Sugar, Water, Bitters, How the Cocktail Conquered the World. I posited the idea of this early proto cocktail. We would call it the Bellini, right? Where a peach drops from a tree and it's a ripe peach and it has the yeast on the surface of it and it starts to bubble and release both CO2 and ethanol. And so a monkey or anybody in the area, as you said, it's highly volatile. The aromatic character of it is you can smell it. It really wouldn't last on the tree that long, but this is all hypothetical. So it falls to the ground, they find it, and then that's their treat, and it's based on the calories. But you're kind of suggesting that one probably is a little too costly to be true. So where do you end up? Since both of those theories you think are not entirely accurate, what is your theory about the evolution of alcohol?
It's got to have some function that helps us either as individuals or groups to survive, or I don't think the taste for it would have survived in our genetic makeup or our cultural repertoire. And it has to be, crucially, it can't just be that it makes us feel good,
Right.
because evolution doesn't care whether we feel good or not. It's got to be something that makes sense in the currency that evolution cares about, which is success and reproductive success. Again, either genetically or culturally. So the bulk of the book is me making an argument for these adaptive functions, and some of them are individual level, so enhanced creativity as an individual, anxiety reduction. Some of them are group, so group innovation effects, kind of collective innovation effects, and crucially, group bonding.
Mhm.
And along the sort of lines that you were talking about in your opening story about people from disparate backgrounds maybe don't have a lot to talk about normally, but you down regulate the prefrontal cortex a bit, you boost up serotonin, endorphins, and next thing you know, you're talking about your dream life and making these friends that you'll have for life. That is in a microcosm one of the major important effects of alcohol. It allowed human beings are a weird species. We're primates, but we don't behave like other primates in a lot of ways. We're completely dependent on technology and innovation in a way no other species is besides us. And we also cooperate with strangers on a scale and with an intensity that looks more like social insects. We look more like kind of ants and termites in that regard than we look like chimpanzees or macaque monkeys. And so we're weird in those two ways, and my argument is that alcohol helps us with being weird in those two ways.
I have been a bartender for a long time, so I can confirm without a doubt that alcohol can make you act very weirdly. I've seen it again and again. So you kind of broke it into three categories. I just want to go back over those a little because you did mention them: creative, cultural, and communal. Is that sort of what you think is the adaptive function of alcohol? Those three main.
What I call the 3C, the creative, cultural, communal, has to do with describing the weird ecological niche that humans occupy. And then alcohol is at least a partial solution to helping us to fill that niche, to fulfill those functions.
Yeah, excellent. And obviously, when you were introducing it and you were talking about ancient kind of Chinese thought around this wu wei or kind of like state of, I guess, a flow state. Would it be described as a flow state in modern
Sure.
psychology? Yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
And so in that case, alcohol is one way to achieve it, but there are other ways to achieve it too. I mean, for instance, I've been obsessed with qigong for a while, and
Mhm.
it's an amazing thing. It's like Tai Chi for people who have tried it, Tai Chi out there, but it doesn't have the quote unquote martial aspect to it. It's not about fighting. It's more about achieving this regulation of energy. And to some degree achieving that flow state. So I wonder, what other instances you've come across of things that they pointed to that would achieve the flow state.
There's the two primary effects of alcohol that are functionally relevant are the fact that it's depressing the function of your prefrontal cortex. So this is
Hmm.
the part of your brain that's in charge of executive function. So suppressing behaviors you don't want to behave in, delaying gratification, staying focused on a task that otherwise is kind of boring and not rewarding. All the kinds of things we have to do to be successful adults, get to work on time, get our jobs done. Um, Alcohol turns that part of the brain down. It also simultaneously is boosting these feel good chemicals in our body, so endorphins, serotonins. There are other ways to do that. You can do it through extreme exercise. So the runner's high is the result of you stress your body out. The PFC, the prefrontal cortex, is the most evolutionarily novel part of the brain.
Hmm.
It's kind of this luxury part of the brain we've developed as human beings. When we stress our body basically starts to look for things to shut down that we don't need to use right now, and that's the first target. So your PFC gets down regulated because your muscles and your heart and your lungs need the energy. Um, you can do it through sleep deprivation. You can do it through extreme pain. So one of the things I talk about is that cultural groups who, for whatever reason, have banned chemical intoxicants, who don't use alcohol or other chemical intoxicants, typically substitute some other practice. So things like qigong, dancing and singing all night, scarifying yourself, doing things that are really painful to yourself. You can get into a very similar state through these other methods, and groups use them as well. But as I point out in the book, these other methods are kind of a hassle. They're
Wait,
not fun.
scarification is a hassle?
Scarification's a hassle. Handling snakes and dancing all night and doing qigong
Yeah.
is not as easy or fun as sitting around a fire drinking some beer. So I think there are other ways to get the same effect that are probably in most cases healthier for you and kind of better. But but alcohol is a pretty quick way to get there and it's pretty easy. So it's why it's remained one of our dominant strategies.
Yeah. And that may also tie a little bit into a part of the mismatch theory in a greater sense, that maybe this idea that alcohol is so easy. And now that we have really high proof alcohol, right? We have Everclear, for instance, but there's several iterations before Everclear. Most people don't just drink straight Everclear, hopefully. It becomes, in a way, like a super stimulus, right? Like it's there and it's easy, and you can go down to any liquor store and get it. And in some ways, that becomes a little bit of a problem from an evolutionary perspective.
Absolutely. So one of my arguments in the book is that alcohol has been adaptive. It's been a net positive for us for most of our history for filling these different functions. But the jury is kind of out in the modern world, and that's because alcohol has very recently become much more dangerous. And the two new dangers I talk about are isolation and distillation. So the first one, distillation. I was in your opening thing about these pots, these ancient pots. It'd be really interesting if some ancient cultures were doing distillation on a small scale.
Yeah.
Um, but on a large scale, so where your average person would have access to distilled liquor, this is like yesterday in evolutionary terms. In the West, it's not until the 1600s. In China, probably maybe 100, 200 years earlier than that. But it blink of an eye in the story that I'm telling, it starts 10 million years ago. Um, Distilled liquors, alcohol's always come with a safety feature which is that naturally distilled or naturally fermented beverages have a safety level on them, right? You can't get above a certain alcohol level before the yeast shut themselves down.
Right.
And we've been relentlessly pushing yeast to get tougher and tougher. So we can now make, these kind of crazy 16% wines and kind of double digit beers. But for most of our evolutionary history, we've been drinking 2% ABV beers and maybe slightly stronger fruit wines. And you can drink those all day, and especially if you have food with them, and you're not going to get dangerously drunk. You're going to stay around this kind of sweet spot of about 0.08 blood alcohol content. Distilled liquors just completely remove that safety feature, and now we can make things that are 90 something percent alcohol, and those beverages they're evolutionarily unprecedented, and our body brain systems are not built to handle alcohol at that concentration. So if you have access to tequila and you're doing shots, you can blow right past 0.08 to really dangerous levels of inebriation in
Indeed.
half an hour.
Yeah.
And that's crazy. We have this very powerful new form of alcohol that we never had before. The other safety feature that was removed is that historically, you never had private access to alcohol. The only time you consumed alcohol was in public settings, usually with all sorts of very serious ritual restrictions and customs that were all kind of unconsciously designed to help you drink safely.
Yeah.
So you would have, someone who was in charge of passing around the wine bowl in the Greek symposium, or to this day in Chinese drinking culture, you don't drink at will. You only drink when someone makes a toast.
Right.
And who's allowed to make a toast is very strictly regulated. So you have ways of and then even in more informal situations, in a pub, you typically order in rounds. So if I
Mhm.
down my beer really quickly and I want to drink another one, I've got to wait a little bit for everyone to catch up. And ideally, even if you're drinking alone in a bar, the bartender should be fulfilling that function of being like the symposiarch at a Greek wine drinking festival, where they think you're drinking too fast. They don't make eye contact with you when you're
Right.
trying to order another drink, right? Um, so there are all these ways we regulate each other's drinking when we're doing it socially. We now live in a society where I can pull into a gas station, and as I'm filling up my car, I go inside and buy a case of tequila and throw it in the trunk and take it home and just have it by myself in my house. And that's crazy. So we have this really powerful alcohol, and we have the ability to drink it alone at home. And I think we saw, in the COVID lockdowns, how bad this combination was. Um, so alcohol's more dangerous, and a lot of the safety features that it used to have been taken away. And so I think that, these kind of movements toward mindful drinking or lower non-alcoholic drinks or sober bars, I think it's a kind of cultural response to how much more dangerous alcohol has become. We're more worried about it now, and for very good reason.
Yeah, in the beginning of colonial America, I think the statistic was something that we drank over 7 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year.
Yeah.
And that was the response to that was a movement called temperance, which temperance was later hijacked by zealots to become prohibition, and obviously that worked really terribly. But it was an attempt at first. You had people like Abraham Lincoln, even, who were advocating for temperance and saying, we're drinking too much. We need to
Yeah.
slow down. And they weren't saying to get rid of alcohol. They were saying that we needed to moderate or change our relationship to alcohol. And then, around the Civil War era, we went from 7, we went down. Prohibition obviously changed that to some degree. And we got back up to around 2.3 gallons per person, which still is a bunch. And we're back to that again as a culture, right? So we're back drinking about the same amount as we did around the Civil War era in the 1860s, which is I find
Mhm.
very interesting because I think that most people, they do see that like Gen Z is drinking less, and that's true. Younger millennials are drinking less, but there's still a group of people who are drinking a lot, and that's usually people my age and older,
Mhm.
who are just drinking a lot of tequila.
Yeah.
They're putting the case of tequila in the back of their car. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so that's really interesting that maybe it is somewhat of a cultural response. And I think that a person who was looking at your book and saw the title and saw a great deal of advocacy in a sense for this idea that alcohol has been an essential part of our culture and our evolution, they might be surprised when you hit this dark side of alcohol.
Yeah, it's part of the story, and it's actually, in a way, the whole premise of the book. So it is the bulk of the book is about these benefits to alcohol that we don't tend to talk about. I think everyone kind of intuitively has a sense that it's a social lubricant, that it
Yep.
might help with creativity, but it's never really been laid out and the evidence assembled, I don't think, in a systematic way. So that is the bulk of the book, and in that sense, I'm celebrating Dionysus, or the function of alcohol. But the whole point of the book is that the reason it's an evolutionary mystery of why we drink is that it's a really dangerous substance. It's really addictive. It's not good for you physiologically. It's the medical opinion right now. The whole French paradox and cholesterol, that seems to be swamped by liver damage and cancer risk. It just seems to be a net negative for us physiologically. It's up to 10% of the population probably is prone to alcohol use disorder, they have trouble drinking safely. It can lead, as we know, to all the drunk driving, violence. It's a dangerous thing, and so the whole reason I wrote the book is to explain why we use this dangerous thing.
Yep.
So I did get some angry pushback from people who were like, "Oh, I grew up in an alcoholic family. How could you defend alcohol?" Um, I think we need to. It's not a just kind of rah rah cheerleading case for alcohol. It's a book that's trying to explain why we use this dangerous tool,
Yep.
and and of course why it's become more dangerous than it historically has been in the last kind of 100 years or so.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. I think, like what I love about your book is that it does take the opportunity to share what alcohol really. It's a clear picture of what alcohol is, but it also says this is really there at some of the earliest human endeavors. Like it's there at the earliest religious functions. It's there when we talk about agriculture. Alcohol has been our companion along the way of human evolution, and so we can't really just discard it easily and say, okay, now we're done with it. It's over. We don't need it anymore. Perhaps there's a more nuanced approach. And I think that that's a really great part of your book. You're listening to the Mindful Drinking Podcast, and my name is Derek Brown, and I welcome you to the show. We're almost done. So rewind if you're just starting. I'm with Dr. Edward Slingerland, who I promised I wouldn't mispronounce his name, and I just almost did it. And we're talking about alcohol and evolution, and we're talking kind of a little bit about the dark side of alcohol as well, which is clearly there. Um, so I think that, when I look at this title, Drunk, How We Sip, Dance, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization, which is your excellent book, um, I almost think that there could be a corollary to this book called Sober, right? And not being about, what we consider sobriety today, but being about this fact that as early as people started drinking, it seems that they started trying to regulate alcohol as well. Have you come across that as well?
Yeah, so we've been using alcohol from the earliest times we know of. And as soon as we get writing, we have people worried about alcohol. We have people trying to prohibit, we have prohibition being attempted. So it's clear that, cultures have always been aware of what I call this dark side of Dionysus, or the fact that the gifts that Dionysus gives can be dangerous. So Dionysus is the one who gave Midas his golden touch, which didn't turn out to be such a great gift after all. So the Greeks were aware that Dionysus was powerful and could give you some wonderful things, but that you needed to be careful with these gifts because they could have a dark side as well. And I think, I mean, if you put in alcohol in Amazon books, every single result you're going to get is about the dark side. It's about alcoholism. It's about how to get over alcoholism. It's about, so I think in some ways I wanted to issue a bit of a corrective to this focus just exclusively on the dangers. We have to see these functions. Once we understand what the positive functions are of alcohol, and we're clear-sighted about the dangers and again, how these dangers have become more acute in the modern world, then we can actually have intelligent policies about what role is alcohol going to play in my personal life as an individual. What role is alcohol going to play in my organization? Maybe I don't want to have alcohol at the holiday party, but I also have to be aware of, so I know what I'm gaining by banning alcohol. I'm not going to have people drunk driving. I'm not going to have people, hitting on each other, falling into the punch bowl. I'm going to protect myself from lawsuits. There's all these downsides I'm going to get rid of. But we also have to be aware of what I'd be losing. I'd be losing the bonding. I'd be losing the uninhibited conversations, people from different departments sharing ideas in a way they wouldn't otherwise. And even knowing then both those things, I may still say, I still don't want alcohol. The negatives outweigh the positives, but at least that's an intelligent decision made with all the facts at my disposal. And I just feel like up until now, when we've been making decisions as a society or as an individual about the role of alcohol in our lives, we've been flying a little bit blind. We haven't had at our disposal both the positives and the negatives. And so I'm just trying to make all that information available, and then you as an individual are going to make your own decisions about how you use alcohol. And it's going to depend also on individual risk factors. Do you have a history of alcoholism? That's going to really change whether or not you think this is a useful tool for you. So I just want our debate, our discussions around alcohol to be more well-rounded and intelligent and based on the best anthropological, historical, scientific data.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think that shows in the book. Um, and I think that, what you're touching on too is something I talk about a lot, is that social wellness is a really critical factor in our health, both individually and collectively, but even individually. Like if we don't have those opportunities to connect to other people, if we don't have those opportunities to have meaningful relationships, then that really is one of the greatest indicators that we're going to have poor health outcomes. So
Yeah.
while alcohol is not entirely necessary for that, it has served that function. And I think that's a really important part of it. I'm glad that you touch on that too. Now, this has been a great conversation, but, and the book came out, when did the book come out?
Several years ago now.
Yeah,
Back
it's been a
in
little while.
2021. Yeah.
Still relevant, but I'm just curious, what are you working on now?
I'm working on an academic book right now that
Okay.
your listeners will not be interested in at all.
Yeah.
But the next trade book is going to be essentially a kind of defense of intelligent hedonism.
Okay.
So why, it springs from at the end of Drunk. I point out the irony of the fact that I've essentially been making an Apollonian argument for Dionysus. So
Mhm.
I've been making a functional argument for this thing that kind of tends to make us not think about functions and be
Right.
relaxed. And I point out at the end, on top of all these functional benefits, alcohol makes us feel good. It's pleasurable. And evolution doesn't care about that, but we do.
Yeah.
Our interests are not coterminous with the interests of our genes. And we shouldn't be so shy about talking about pleasure and
Mhm.
the importance of pleasure in life. And so there is this kind of neo-Puritan tinge to the modern world that I fight back against a bit at the end of the book, but I want to expand on that theme in the next book, which will be a kind of defense of hedonism, intelligent hedonism, not gluttony or kind of crazy out of control hedonism, but taking simple pleasures in life and the importance of simple pleasures.
Yeah, it feels very much, it feels very Epicurean, not in the narrow sense of being about food, but in this philosophy of hedonism and an intelligent hedonism. And I remember that one of the Epicurean philosophers, if it wasn't Epicurus himself, talked about friendship being one of the greatest pleasures in the world. And I would not say that's wrong. Certainly, I derive a great deal of pleasure myself from the friendships and relationships I have. And I have derived a great deal of pleasure from learning from you and this episode here. So I look forward to that book, and I really appreciate you coming today. Before I sign off, I just want to remind people that you could win a $100 Amazon gift card by going to the link in this episode and following the survey. You could win. It doesn't mean you will win, just to clarify. But otherwise, Dr. Edward Slingerland, I want to thank you for coming on the show today and being a part of the Mindful Drinking Podcast. And we look forward to everything to come.
Great. Thanks for having me.